Brother Fields, are you a grasshopper?
Well, I doubt seriously if you've given much thought to that question, perhaps until Tuesday evening. But before you answer the question, I want to remind you of a couple of things. First of all, grasshoppers are rather ugly, isn't it true? Insignificant, not worth all that much, so you probably never really thought about being one. But before you answer, consider this. This is a little story that I heard. It's once upon a time story. It's not true, but it makes a nice point anyway. But once upon a time, there was a lady that was standing at the kitchen sink doing dishes. And her handyman husband had left the screen off the window, hadn't put it back on yet. She had the window open, it's a nice spring day, and she's washing dishes. And while she's standing there washing dishes, this big, ugly grasshopper comes jumping through the window and landed on her arm right there. So she looked at that grasshopper and she said, "You get off of there." And just as she said that, it jumped over on the cabinet. She thought, well, that was interesting. So she washed another dish or two, and she looked at that grasshopper and she said, "Not there, over there." And he did. Wow, just like that. She looked at that grasshopper and said, "Roll over." And he did. About that time, her young teenage son comes bouncing down the stairs, sees that ugly grasshopper, grabs a book and goes smack. But she reaches out and grabs his arm and said, "Don't you mash my grasshopper." Now, friends, what was it that caused that woman to protect the life of that ugly, insignificant grasshopper? Isn't it true? It did what it was told to do. It won the approval of that woman, which saved its life because it was obedient. Now, do you want to be a grasshopper? Helps you to put a little different light on it, doesn't it? Did you know that the thought that came to my mind, the reason I came up with that is in the Scriptures, did you know there are times that the friends, some of our brothers, have felt like grasshoppers? Go back to the book of Numbers, if you would, please. Numbers chapter 13. And no doubt as we read this text, you'll come to appreciate why these individuals felt a little insignificant or grasshopper-like. In Numbers chapter 13, you look at verse 33, and we'll set the scene for you a little bit. Remember the 12 spies went into the promised land? They were supposed to spy it out, and they found large people in there. Notice what they said in verse 33. The 10 spies came back and said, "And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who are from the Nephilim, so that we became in our own eyes like grasshoppers." And notice, in the same way we became in their eyes. So these 10 of the 12 spies came back and said, "We can't take the promised land. There are giants in there." And there's no doubt in my mind that those individuals felt a little insignificant, maybe out of place, maybe in the wrong territory, like the grasshopper did that we were talking about. Perhaps they felt very, very insignificant in those circumstances. But interestingly, in chapter 14, verse 8, we find that Joshua and Caleb had a different view, even though they may have felt a little insignificant. In verse 8 it says this, "If Jehovah has found delight in us, then he will certainly bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that is flowing with milk and honey." So have you ever felt insignificant? Have you ever felt like maybe you were a little out of place, or maybe you felt like you were not able to do what Jehovah had asked you to do? Maybe the service, maybe pioneering, maybe maybe a talk or whatever. Isn't it true that if we have the attitude, if we're obedient to Jehovah like Joshua and Caleb were, then as they said, we'll be able to do what Jehovah has told us to do. That insignificant feeling will certainly go away. So as we look at these points, the question has to come to our mind is how important is obedience? Just really how important is it to those who serve Jehovah? To answer that, let's go to Romans chapter 5, please. In Romans chapter 5, we find an account, really a contrasting account, an account not of obedience, but an account of disobedience. It's in Romans chapter 5. And as we look at verse 19, you'll recognize the account. Notice what happened in this situation. It says, "For just as through the disobedience of the one man," that was Adam, "many were constituted sinners." So here we see that through this one act of disobedience, that all the problems, all the pain, all the dying, all the death, all the other things that we have to deal with came because of this one act of disobedience. Doesn't it really make you wish that this person had been obedient and really listened to Jehovah? We wouldn't have all the problems we have today. But on the other hand, when we look into the Scriptures, after Adam was disobedient and became imperfect and fathered children, as we study the Scriptures, we find that there are many, many, many examples of individuals in the Bible who were imperfect, but yet they had tremendous success in serving Jehovah because they were obedient. You'll remember some of the names: Samuel, Jonathan, David, Gideon, individuals who, through loyal obedience, had tremendous success in serving Jehovah, even as an imperfect individual. Gideon's a good example. You remember the account about Gideon? He took just a real small army and was able to defeat a vast military machine, all because he did what Jehovah told him to do. So let's narrow our question down just a little bit and ask it again about not just how important is obedience, but how important is it that you and I would be obedient? Let's go to 1 Samuel to try to find our answer. 1 Samuel chapter 15. And let's start there and read verse 22. 1 Samuel 15 and verse 22. And notice Samuel's words as he addresses and answers that very question that we have. How important is obedience? In verse 22, notice it says, "In turn Samuel said, 'Does Jehovah have as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of Jehovah?' He said, 'Look, to obey is better than a sacrifice, to pay attention than the fat of rams.'" Samuel's answer to that question, being inspired by Jehovah, was that it's much better to be obedient to Jehovah than it is to have to pay the price or make a sacrifice for being disobedient. Now, to illustrate our point more, let's go back to the illustration about the grasshopper. Can you think of anything that that grasshopper could have done that would make that woman want to protect its life more so than being obedient? Now, from a grasshopper standpoint, it had a few options. It had a few choices. Remember, we said it was a spring day. So perhaps as this grasshopper looked around, it thought, I can find something very valuable, and I'll take it into that woman, and no doubt she'll want to protect me. She'll take good care of me. So he looks around in the lawn and what have you, and he finds a nice piece of green grass. So he nips that little piece of green grass off and holds it between his little arms and goes jumping through the window and lays it out as a little gift, a little sacrifice to that woman. Do you think she'd protect it for bringing that piece of grass in the house? I doubt it, don't you? So let's say that he looks around and he tries to find something, maybe an antique. Now, springtime, green grass, that means an antique would be a brown twig left over from last year. So he looks around, he hunts around, he finds this really nice, shiny little piece of brown twig, and he manages to get that between his little arms, and he goes jumping through the window and lays that out on the kitchen cabinet. Do you think she'd protect him for that? I don't think so. She'd probably call that teenage son of hers and say, "Get that stick and that grasshopper out here." Isn't that true? Probably get rid of both of them. You see, there's nothing, absolutely nothing in that illustration that that grasshopper could have done that would be more effective to get that woman to protect it than for it to be obedient. No comparison. Now, what about us with Jehovah? What would be more likely to get Jehovah to protect us and look after us than to be obedient to Him? From a human standpoint, we have a few things, a few choices. For example, let's say this. Let's have all of you brothers and sisters to pass your diamonds and your gold and your watches and things like that down to the end of the rows. And we'll have the attendants pick them up and bring them down here. We'll make a nice sacrifice to Jehovah this morning. You think he'd protect the congregation for that? Don't think so? Oh, I know. Let's write him a check. No? Ooh, let's give him our credit card, our Visa card, and he can go do what he wants to do. Do you realize that you just chuckled, you just laughed at the thought that if we gave things to Jehovah that the world puts their very future in, a credit line, a bank account, material things and what have you, do you realize that you just laughed at the thought that those would have an effect on our relationship with Jehovah? But yet that's what the world puts their very future in. So there's absolutely positively nothing that we can do that would cause Jehovah to want to protect us and give us everlasting life than being obedient to Him in every circumstance. So our next question is, where does obedience like that come from? Where does obedience, where an individual is, obedience to Jehovah is more valuable to that person than money or a job or a credit line or a bank account or any material things? Where does that kind of obedience come from? Let's go back to Romans, this time chapter 6. In Romans chapter 6, again, we're just interested in the first part of the verse, and we find that Paul said something to these friends that answers our question as well. In Romans chapter 6 and verse 17, notice what he said about where that kind of obedience comes from. Verse 17, Paul said, "But thanks to God that you were the slaves of sin, but you became obedient from the heart." So this kind of obedience that we're talking about is not something that we're forced into. It's not something that we're made to do. But an obedient individual, that comes from a heart that's filled with love. That comes from a heart that's filled with appreciation. That comes from a heartfelt feeling of wanting, looking for ways to find out how Jehovah wants us to do things. Now, to illustrate our point, let's say that when we started our meeting this morning that we had someone come and sit in this chair And they've been here all morning. You don't know them. You've never seen them before you came to the Kingdom Hall this morning. So they've been sitting there for the last couple of hours. And as you looked at them, can you tell by looking at them if they have faith or not? Isn't it true you could watch them for the rest of the meeting? Matter of fact, we could have them come back for the next 6 months or so and sit up here in this chair all during the meetings, and you'd never know if they had faith or not. You know why? Faith is of the heart, and it is invisible to men. Action is of conduct, and it can be observed by other individuals. So the only way you'd ever know if that person has faith or not is when you saw the Kingdom Hall door open. It's time for the meetings. That person comes walking in. You see them going out in the field ministry regularly. You see them making sacrifices of praise to Jehovah. You see them facing challenges and remaining faithful to Jehovah. Then you know if that person has faith or not. In summary of that point, it means this. The only possible evidence that we can give that we believe Jehovah, believe what He says, is by our conduct. Now let me say that one more time. When we obey God, that's the only possible evidence that we can give that in our hearts we really believe what He says. Reflecting back on Gideon, did he give evidence that he believed what Jehovah said? Were his strategy and his tactics different than anyone else because he believed what Jehovah had to say? When Gideon's strategy was put into play, it certainly did show that he believed what Jehovah said. Looking at an answer for all those questions, if you could just consider this for a few moments. In Gideon's day, the Bible account says that there was a vast military machine as numerous as the locusts that invaded Israel. Actually, there were 135,000 of them, according to the account. The Bible indicates that Jehovah then told Gideon to muster up an army and to go out and defeat that vast military machine. Among those 135,000, it was also said that not only were they demonized, trained military killers, but they had a secret weapon, a military weapon. They had camels that were trained for warfare. Can you imagine a trained killer on top of a camel riding into foot soldiers, the damage that they could really do, and the defense that provided for them? So when Gideon mustered up this army of 32,000 against those 135,000, and by the way, those odds are not very good, Jehovah began to give him direction or guidelines on how to defeat this seemingly overwhelming military force. Let's notice what happened in Judges chapter 7. If you'll hold your Bible here in Judges chapter 7, we want to look at 2 or 3 points. But first of all, as we scan the chapter together, we notice in verses 2 and 3 that it tells us that Jehovah knew that He was going to bless them, and those 32,000 would be victorious. They would beat that military machine. But Jehovah said those 32,000 will come back after they do that, and they'll say, look what we did. Look what we were able to do. In other words, they would take the credit, and the credit should go to Jehovah. So in these verses, Jehovah told Gideon, He said, send all of those home that are fearful. Can you imagine how Gideon felt when 22,000 of them went home? Now he has 10,000 individuals. If you're keeping up with the numbers and what have you, he has 10,000 soldiers. That's about 13 and a half people against the militarized army that he's 13 and a half to 1. But then Jehovah said, those 10,000 are going to defeat that army, and they're going to come back and they're going to brag about, look what we've done. So He gave them the drink test. Remember the drink test? He told him, He said, you take those 10,000 individuals down to the water and you watch them drink. And the ones who drink like a dog, you send them home. You know why? A dog has to look into the water to drink. He can't watch what's going on. So He said, you watch those individuals, and those who keep their eyes on what's going on, reach into the water and bring the water up to their mouth like this, said, you keep those individuals. You remember what the number was? 300. 300 men drank water and passed the test. Now the odds are tremendous. Just to illustrate what the odds are, if you can remember the last time you went to the Special Assembly Day or the Circuit Assembly, there were somewhere around 1,000 people there, 900 to 1,000 people, something like that. And so that means that the odds now of the 300 against 135,000 would be like you and your friend against everybody in the assembly hall. Now remember, everyone in the assembly hall in this illustration are a trained, demonized, militarized killer. And you and your friend are you. And that's about where it goes. Now, those are not very good odds, isn't it true? So would Gideon's strategy be different? Would he think differently? Would he use normal military procedure? Would he get advice from another military commander on how to be able to go about this task? I don't think so. You see, his strategy was somewhat different. Now look at verse 16 of Judges 7 and notice what did happen. Verse 16, it says, "Then he, Gideon, divided the 300 men up into 3 bands." So he's got 3 groups of 100 individuals. And it says, into 3 bands, and he put horns in the hands of all of them, and large empty jars and torches inside the large jars. Let's say that you and any other individual, even a military commander, let's say that you were in an advantage point somewhere and you could watch what Gideon was doing. And he divided up these 3 groups of 100 in each group, and he gave them a horn and a jar and a torch and said, "We're going to go to war." What do you think? You see, you cannot imagine. If someone who didn't know Jehovah would say, "There's something bad wrong with this," he must have TNT or dynamite or something in those jars, right? But no, they were empty jars, the Bible says. And so then Gideon went on and followed the instructions. Look at verse 19. It says, "In time Gideon came with the 100 men who were with him to the edge of the camp at the start of the middle night watch. They had just got through posting the sentries, and they proceeded to blow the horns, and there was a dashing to pieces of the large water jars that were in their hands." And notice this. At that, the 3 bands blew the horns, shattered the large jars, took fresh hold on their torches with their left hand and with their right hand on their horns to blow them. And they began calling out, "Jehovah's sword and Gideon." Friends, they routed that vast military machine with some empty jars, torches, and horns because they were obedient. Now, as we give consideration to that, friends, are we today instructed to do things that the world would not go along with? Are we today asked to be obedient in things that others might think were unusual? When other people observe our life today, would they go along with what we do? Isn't it a fact that most people, most of our neighbors, don't even understand our way of life? Just a couple of weeks ago, you went to the district convention. And no doubt you came back to work Monday or back to school or back to the neighborhood or whatever. And someone said, "What'd you do over the weekend?" "Oh, I went down to the Tacoma Dome and went to this nice religious convention." And they're probably thinking, "You did what? Wasn't that a pretty weekend? And you were inside the Tacoma Dome all weekend?" Or you may go to work Monday or tomorrow or go back to school or see your neighbors and say, "What'd you do yesterday?" "Oh, we listened to this guy give a couple of talks down at the Kingdom Hall." And they're going to say, "You did what? What'd you do Saturday?" "Oh, went out door to door, went to field service." See, people don't understand us, even going to 5 meetings a week, going to the Kingdom Hall, going out in field service, attending conventions and things of that. They don't understand that. But see, these are tools like horns and torches and jars that Jehovah has given us in these last days that we can use to be able to be successful in serving Jehovah, just as Gideon and his men were successful. So friends, we should have a different strategy than all of our neighbors have. Our strategy should be so different that we should consider these provisions from Jehovah, meetings, field service, conventions, all of those different things, personal study, Bible reading. All those provisions from Jehovah are more valuable to us than things like money, a bank account, antiques, gold, silver, materials. So it causes us to ask a few questions about what should our strategy be? What should our focus be? Really, how could we know what to focus on? Look back at Judges chapter 7. In verse 17, we find that Gideon told his men just what to do. Verse 17, it says, "And he went on to say to them, 'You should learn from watching me, and that is how you should do. And when I come to the edge of the camp, it must also occur that just as I shall do, so you will do.'" He told those 300 men, "Just watch what I do, and you do that." How many times have we been told and compared that Jesus Christ is a greater Gideon? So all we have to do is watch Jesus. Jesus goes, we go. He goes this direction, we go that direction. You say, but how can we watch him? He's invisible. The Watchtower magazine of 1982, June 1st, answered that very question. How can we watch Jesus, the greater Gideon, when he's invisible? It says, we watch him in the sense that we discern his signals as given through his visible organization. Through this Spirit-appointed channel, His direction and strategy are communicated to all who are His soldiers. In summary, what does that mean? All we have to do is watch the visible organization today. What it does is what we do. And friends, if you've ever noticed the visible organization, when you look at the organization, what do we learn? Where is the emphasis? Have you noticed that the emphasis from Jehovah's organization is and has been, always has been, emphasizing spiritual pursuits, spiritual goals, spiritual things? As a matter of fact, if you had a visiting speaker come to your Kingdom Hall, and he got up here on the platform and started giving a talk, and he said, we've changed our strategy just a little bit. We realize the system's going to go on longer than we thought it was. It's already gone on longer, so we want you, friends, to start thinking about your bank accounts and about your retirement and whatever. Give that some serious thought now. What would you do? You'd stop the meeting, isn't it true? Your presiding overseer and about 4 or 5 other elders would be marching him out of the Kingdom Hall, because that's not what Jehovah's organization does. That's not what Jesus is doing. The emphasis has always been on putting spiritual pursuits first. So with these things in mind, are there things that you personally would like to do in Jehovah's service that maybe someone's told you you can't do that? Are there things you'd like to do in Jehovah's service that maybe you've told yourself, that's just not possible for me? Perhaps getting into the full-time ministry, being a regular pioneer. For some of you young brothers, maybe becoming a ministerial servant. For some of you brothers who are ministerial servants, working hard to meet the qualifications of an overseer. Maybe it's just that you want to do more in Jehovah's service, really want to put more into it, more active in Jehovah's service. Is it possible to do those things? Well, are you convinced that Jehovah can do things today like He did in Gideon's case? Same God, same Holy Spirit, same Heavenly Father as it was back in Gideon's today. If He could do it in Gideon's case, can you imagine He can do things that are unimagined by us, by men, if we just listen to what Jehovah says? So what should our focus be? What are some of the things that you and I would want to be obedient in? Turn your Bibles to Matthew chapter 6. In Matthew chapter 6, we find an interesting comment that we want to relate to Jehovah's organization today. And it's about Jehovah. But if we're convinced that this is His organization, and Jesus is the head of it, you'll see the value of this text. Matthew 6, verse 8. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 8. In verse 8, we find that when it comes to our needs and what we really need for our spiritual guidance and even for our lives, verse 8 says, "So do not make yourselves like them." Notice, "For God your Father knows what things you are needing before ever you ask Him." When it comes to direction from the faithful and discreet slave, when it comes from direction through the magazine and through the congregation, friends, we should never question what they tell us about things, because this text says Jehovah already knew what we needed before we even realized it. Have you ever seen a change in our understanding of matters or whatever that you didn't quite grasp, you couldn't quite understand? Well, we've thought this for X number of years, and now we have new light. That's why. Jehovah knows what we need when we need it. So we should never be an individual that would not be obedient to Jehovah's organization. And in thinking about that, go to Hebrews 13. The text here certainly applies to Jehovah's organization, but this morning we want to apply this to the elders in the congregation. This is an area that we find that most of our neighbors would never do this, and that is be obedient to men in the congregation. Hebrews 13, verse 17, notice the account. Here Jehovah's instruction to us is, "Be obedient to those who are taking the lead among you, and be submissive, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who will render an account, that they may do this with joy and not with sighing, for this would be damaging to you." This text indicates that we should be not only obedient to the organization, but we should be obedient to the men, imperfect men, that Jehovah is using in the congregation, appointed elders. Now, once in a while, you'll look at one of those brothers and you'll recognize all of his imperfections and all of his shortcomings, and the next thing you know, you're having a little bit of difficulty with your relationship with that brother. How should we feel about being obedient to the instructions there in Hebrews? Go back to 1 Samuel chapter 26. In this account, we find something that we can compare with. You remember that Saul was the king, and he had become very wicked. David was running from him. Saul had tried to kill him on more than one occasion. Where we look in 1 Samuel chapter 26, we find that David and Abishai have found Saul sleeping. Now remember, Saul's tried to kill him more than once. Abishai is trying to convince David that here's your chance. God has given him to you. Let's put him to death. Notice chapter 26, verse 8. It says, Abishai now said to David, God has today surrendered your enemy into your hand. And now let me please pin him to the earth with the spear just once, and I shall not do it to him twice. Notice the response in verse 9. It says, however, David said to Abishai, do not bring him to ruin, for who is it that has thrust his hand out against the anointed of Jehovah and has remained innocent? See, he recognized Saul was anointed by Jehovah. Look in verse 11. He said, it is unthinkable on my part, from Jehovah's standpoint, to thrust my hand out against the anointed of Jehovah. So do you see the principle there? I doubt very, very, very seriously that the elders are trying to kill you. But if they are, please let me know, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And our elders today, for the most part, are not anointed. But isn't it true, friends, they are appointed by the same Holy Spirit that anointed Saul. And so what should our attitude be about the appointed brothers? You see, it should be unthinkable on our part to lift our hand, or should we say our tongue, against the appointed elders in the congregation. Now, we are not saying that if an elder went bad, as Saul went bad, that we shouldn't do something about that. But what we are saying is that we would follow Jehovah's means of taking care of that. Now, we're not talking about personality difficulties, or I don't like the way he dresses, or the way he looked at me, or something like that. But let's say that one of the elders did go bad. We're talking wicked. What would be the proper way to handle that? Obviously, your responsibility as a Christian would be to go to the presiding overseer, Brother Baldwin, and report that. Unless, of course, he's the one who went bad. Then you go to one of the other elders. But you go to the proper procedure, you go to the elders, and you report what you know about that, and you let Jehovah take care of it. See, and otherwise we'd be raising our hand, or our tongue, as it were, if we went around and told everyone else in the congregation about this brother's shortcomings. That's not Jehovah's way of doing things. Let Jehovah take care of it in His way. Report that to the elders and let them take care of that. Now, sometimes we get to feeling pretty good about ourselves, and I think sometimes that we know more than we really know. Have you ever known an individual, or maybe you felt this way, and by the way, the odds that you will be right are pretty slim, but have you ever thought that you knew better than the organization? You can't understand why they did this, or you can't understand why they did that, and so maybe you have a better idea? So if you've ever had that tendency to think that you know more than Jehovah's organization, I'll tell you this, that the odds that you know more than they do on any subject is about 1 billion, trillion, zillion, quadrillion to this. Okay? You're not going to be smarter than Jehovah's organization. But if you seem to think you are in any particular area, and we encourage you not to push ahead with that. The point is we stick with Jehovah's organization. Have you ever thought they're wrong about something? They're not wrong. Do we track or tack as a sailboat does? Yes, we do. We learn as we go along. But the organization's never been wrong enough to cause anyone to lose their life. Now, here's an illustration to help you to appreciate that. Remember earlier we talked about the 12 spies that went into the Promised Land? And 10 of them came back and said, we can't take the Promised Land. Joshua and Caleb said, oh, yes, we can. We can with Jehovah's help. Now, what did they do? What did Joshua and Caleb do? Did they go against the 10 and say, we can do it, and strike out on their own and push ahead and try to take the Promised Land? No, they didn't do that. They stuck with, quote unquote, the organization. Now, what's the point of that? If we stick to Jehovah's organization, friends, if we do what we're told, if we're obedient to that organization, from Jehovah's standpoint, we never, ever, ever, ever will be wrong. Because this is Jehovah's organization. If we do what they tell us to do, we're doing what Jehovah said to do. So all we need to worry about is just being obedient to the organization, following God's guidelines given through His Word, the Bible, and through His organization. We'll always be right with God if we do that. Now, you may have noticed that in the Bible that there are many things that there are no laws on. There are principles, guidelines. Some individuals feel that since a guideline is a matter that you could not be disfellowshipped for or removed from the congregation for disobeying it, that principles are not as important as laws and guidelines. Remember earlier we said that obedience comes from the heart, a heart full of appreciation. So if an individual really appreciates Jehovah and there's a principle that could be violated and still remain part of the congregation, what should our attitude be? You see, if we found ourselves for some reason with the opportunity to be independent from Jehovah, isn't it true, out of a heart filled of appreciation, we would run back to Jehovah just as quick as we could and live by every one of those guidelines, no matter how small they are. When Jehovah gives us a principle or a guideline to live by, friends, we should live by it. You remember what some of them cover, things that shouldn't be mentioned among us. Whatever we do, we should do for Jehovah. If you're married, you shouldn't separate from your mate. If you're not married, you shouldn't marry someone that's not in the truth. Go to your brother, make peace. All of those are guidelines that we should take it seriously to heart and live our lives by them instead of trying to find some way to not be under Jehovah's direction there. So if you want to be a grasshopper in Jehovah's eyes, you want to reap all the benefits of being viewed as such, if we do, we will be obedient. Obedient from the heart. So are you a grasshopper? How can you know? Well, if you find yourself hopping down to the Kingdom Hall every time the door opens to go to the meetings, find yourself hopping from door to door out in field service, find yourself hopping from chapter to chapter in the Bible and the Society's publications as you do research, then you're a spiritual grasshopper. And the value of that is this. Friends, when we make it through this whole system of things, and we make it through the Great Tribulation, we make it through Armageddon, all the way through the 1,000 years, and get on the other end, way on the other end of that 1,000 years, there's going to be one final test. Satan's going to be let loose. You know what that test is going to be about? It will be a test of our obedience. May we all continue to be obedient, and may we continue to have Jehovah's protection as He leads us in His organization right into that new world of righteousness.